Listen to me, see if you agree with this. So, for me, the idea of dying is terrifying, but the only thing that's even more terrifying is that moment right before it. You know, those few seconds where you know that you're about to die, but there's absolutely nothing that you can do to stop it. And listen, I know that's a heavy way to start this video, but on a summer day in 1990, 45 climbers high up on Lenin Peak were about to experience that exact horrifying realization at the exact same time. This would become the deadliest single day in mountaineering history, and yet somehow, that's not even the most disturbing part of the story. It was the evening of Friday, July 13th, and 45 climbers from 8 different countries were camped at 17,400 feet on this Soviet mountain that most of them had never even heard of just a few months earlier. They were relaxing, drinking tea, playing cards, probably telling stories. And a few days earlier, one of those 45 climbers, a Russian named Alexei Korin, a certified veteran who knew this mountain better than almost anyone, well, he pulled another team aside and told them not to camp here, the exact spot where all of these climbers were camped. And he said that this spot has a history of avalanches. And so with this warning, the team decided to pitch their tents a few hundred yards short of the main site where everyone else was. Alexei, however, didn't take his own advice. He literally warned these other climbers not to set up camp here, and then he did exactly that. And that's the thing that should stop you. Honestly, it stopped me. This isn't a story about people who made an innocent mistake or didn't know better. It's a story about a man who knew better than almost anyone, even warned other people, watched them listen to his warning, and then did it anyways. And while all of this was going on, while Alexei was literally asleep in his tent, somewhere high up above him, on a ridge 3,000 feet higher above him for that matter, a slope that's been quietly accumulating snow for years, well, it's just started to move. Oh, and speaking of moving, our subscriber count has been moving up, and look, we're trying to get to 1 million subscribers, and you're gonna notice that we are very, very close. And so if this is your first time watching, you don't have to subscribe yet. I'm gonna do my best to earn your subscription by the end of this video, and if you're a regular viewer, please subscribe, and if you're already subscribed, I appreciate you very much. So everyone's laying there asleep in their tents, and then within seconds, this wave of snow swallowed the camp whole. Like, I don't know how else to say it. It swallowed the camp whole, and then it settled. Things went quiet. The kind of silence that exists specifically because there was literally nothing left standing to make any noise. Or that is actually, until after a few long seconds, a single cry for help rang along the mountainside. And we're actually going to come back to this exact moment because the avalanche is only part of the full insane story of who was actually making that noise, who was screaming under that snow, who was still breathing, and even who was about to spend the worst night of their life just feet away from people that they loved, buried alive. And even if you're someone who watches a lot of these like mountaineering disaster videos, there's a good chance that you haven't heard this story before, but after I tell it to you, I guarantee that you are never going to forget what happened on Lenin Peak. So Lenin Peak sits in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, straddling the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And this mountain range is often called the roof of the world because of the giant flat plateaus that sit over 23,000 feet in the sky. Lenin Peak, which is the second tallest peak in the range, goes by a different name today, and I'm gonna butcher this, but it's Ibn Sina, I think, but back in the day, it was named after Vladimir Lenin. And so we're gonna stick with that name for this video, not only because I can actually pronounce it, but also since it's what it was called in 1990, the year that Lenin Peak made all kinds of headlines for all of the wrong reasons. Among Soviet climbers, Lenin Peak had one specific reputation. Of the 5 7,000 meter peaks across Soviet Russia, it was the easiest 7,000 meter peak to summit. I mean, Lenin Peak was the mountain that experienced alpinists used as like a warm-up before more technical routes. There were no sections of truly like vertical ice, no serious rock pitches, just a long, slow walk to altitude spread over about 2 weeks. Now, in the summer of 1990, Lenin Peak was unusually crowded for two specific reasons. First, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had just cracked open Soviet borders, letting Western climbers onto these peaks for the first time in most of their lives, frankly. And second, this thing called commercial guided mountaineering. You know, the same business model that would later turn Mount Everest into a seasonal traffic jam. Well, that was just getting off the ground, and Lenin Peak, you know, the warm-up 7,000er, well, it was one of the first beneficiaries. And the result was that in July of 1990, Lenin Peak's base camp was alive more than it had been in decades, right? I mean, if you were at base camp, you would be hearing many different languages being spoken all around you. A 15-person Soviet expedition from Czechoslovakia studying altitude sickness. A brand new British guided company called Out There Trekking on the very first expedition they had ever run. Climbers from Switzerland, Germany, Spain, Italy, Israel, all of these different teams looking up at the roof of the world, eager to stand on it. The international community was embracing Russia and vice versa for the first time in decades. It was truly this historic moment in global diplomacy, let alone mountaineering. But little did these climbers know, they were walking into a season that would make even more history, and once again, for all the wrong reasons. Folks, this story is about to get very heavy, and so just for a brief moment, I want to tell you a different story that's actually a lot more fun. The story of how I learned who I am literally from like a DNA level. This is so cool. So everything I thought I knew about my background might be wrong, and I'm about to find out. This is a paid partnership with MyHeritage, and you can get their DNA kit for only $19 or euros when you use my code HIKING. So a few weeks ago, I took the test. It was super easy, and the results are finally in, and so let's open them up together. Here we go. Okay, wow. This first part isn't surprising, but the next part is I'm 31.1% Irish, 21.3% Portuguese, which I did not know, 19.1% Scottish and Welsh, 12% English, and 5.3% Dutch. And like seeing this exact breakdown is so much cooler than just having like a vague idea of where I come from. I always just assumed I was Irish because of my last name, but this is just like so much more detailed. And MyHeritage also found 18,779 DNA matches, including a third cousin connected through our shared great-great-grandfather in New England. And the My Ancient Origins feature traced me from Bronze Age European farmers and Central Steppe nomads to a 41.8% insular Celtic component by the Middle Ages. Like, how cool is that? I would have never known this. And then the traits report says that I likely have high aerobic capacity, as well as creativity and a sharp memory, you know? And like the aerobic capacity makes sense for someone who hikes a lot, but the sharp memory is slightly more debatable. You can get your own kit for only $19 or euros with my code HIKING, plus you're gonna get free shipping and a 30-day free trial. And by the way, that is much lower pricing than any of their competitors. MyHeritage has committed in their privacy policy to never sell or license genetic data. You fully own your DNA and you can delete it at any time. So one more time, click the link below or scan the QR code and use code HIKING at checkout so you can get this amazing deal. Thank you so much to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video, and let's get back into it. So there's three groups of people that you need to know before we get to the night of July 13th. The first came from a small Slovakian town called, here we go, Slavenska Lajupcha. Nailed it. Three childhood friends had grown up doing exactly what kids in that part of the world do. Cross-country skiing in the winter, ski jumping when they were feeling a bit brave, and eventually, as they got older, real technical climbing and ski mountaineering. Their names were Miroslav Miro Brosman and his two best friends, Vlad and Brano. They'd met at school and quickly became inseparable no matter what adventure lay ahead of them, right? In the spring of 1990, the trio had just notched their first peaks outside of their home range, climbing in the Austrian Alps for the very first time. And then not long after they got home, their local mountaineering club approached them with an offer that must have felt, especially for three guys from a small town, like winning a lottery they didn't even know they'd entered. A spot on a 15-person medical mountaineering expedition headed to Lenin Peak, where doctors would study how low blood CO2 levels affect the onset of altitude sickness. When given this offer, the men said yes immediately, because I mean, Of course they did, right? They were 21, 22 years old, and someone was offering them a free trip to the roof of the world. Nobody in like human history up to that point had ever turned that offer down out of an abundance of caution. Remember, this is supposed to be an easier mountain. And so on the morning of July 13th, those three friends climbed up from base camp, stopping along the way to help a struggling Spanish climber who was fighting fatigue, escorting him the final stretch before settling into their own tent for the evening. And then once they did what climbers at altitude do to kind of pass the hours, right? They made some tea, then some pudding, and then, of course, more tea. They ate some biscuits, they put on nearly every layer of clothing that they'd packed, and then they crawled into their sleeping bags to play cards and kind of just talk through tomorrow's route to the summit. Tomorrow was going to be the day. This is the kind of like cozy, mundane, completely unremarkable evening that becomes truly eerie once you know what happened next. Now, the second person that you need to know is actually the person I introduced earlier in the video, Alexei Korin, 35 years old, a Russian climber who'd earned the Soviet Master of Sport classification, which is basically the equivalent of like a national mountaineering champion, right? Alexei was a Lenin Peak regular, a fixture of the climbing scene there, the kind of guy that other climbers recognized on sight. In July of 1990, he was part of a 19-person team from the Leningrad Mountaineering Club, and for them, Lenin Peak wasn't even the real objective. It was a practice, a tune-up before something far more ambitious that they had planned later that year. Choi Oyu, which is the 6th highest mountain on the planet. Lenin Peak was exactly the easy warm-up that they were looking for. Now, Alexei was known to be kind of a diplomat of the mountain. He was always offering advice to other climbing teams, calling on wisdom that he'd built up over decades to help those who may have been climbing Russian peaks for the first time. Actually, a few days before, Alexei pulled aside a different group of climbers, the British-led Out There trekking team, and he warned them that the specific spot they were considering for their camp had a documented history of avalanches. And to be clear, this was just like a casual observation. It wasn't like a stern warning, like do not camp here. I think you get what I'm saying. And yet, despite Alexei's casual demeanor, the British-led team took it as an actual warning. And so they decided to camp a few hundred yards short of the main camp instead, out on their own separate snow shelf. Alexei did not extend himself the same courtesy. On the afternoon of July 13th, he climbed all the way up to the camp itself, the exact bowl-shaped basin that he'd warned the other climbers about, and then he set up his tent and crawled into it for the night. And I want you to think about this. It's a strange, very human thing to do, identifying a danger for someone else while somehow failing to apply it to your own decisions. But hold on to that thought for a few minutes because it's about to matter a lot more than you might realize. The third group that you need to know is that exact same 6-person British-led expedition out there trekking. And even though they were first-timers on Lenin Peak, their leader was a very respected English climber named Mark Miller, traveling alongside expedition doctor Mike Cross. And among this group was also a 27-year-old Argentine-American climber named Miguel Helft. Miguel had fallen into mountaineering after getting bored with a tech job in Silicon Valley, and now he was soaking in every detail of this once-in-a-lifetime summit attempt in Soviet Russia. I mean, that's crazy, right? He was paying attention to Alexei Korin's advice, watching the mastery of the mountains. For him, all of this was brand new and extremely exciting. On July 13th, this 6-person British-led team was grinding up from Camp 1 towards Camp 2, slowed by deep snow and just the general misery of trying to breathe and exercise strenuously above 15,000 feet in altitude. And by late afternoon, they could actually see Camp 2 in the distance. There was roughly 20 tents, 45 climbers kind of milling around, a camp that was known as the frying pan to locals due to how flat its terrain was. Under normal conditions, the remaining traverse would have taken maybe a half hour, but it turns out that these were not normal conditions. The out there trekking team was exhausted and the snow was fighting them with pretty much every single step. And so Mark Miller looked at his tired group and made an executive decision. We're going to stop here a few hundred meters short of the main camp, and we're going to pitch our tents right here for the night. And again, remember, Alexei had said something about the avalanche risk a little bit further up. I mean, probably nothing to worry about, but hey, one more reason to justify their decision. Around sunset that evening, the mood was lively in Camp 2. Once again, many different languages were being spoken. Climbers from all around the world were sharing tea, sharing jokes, sharing stories. Miro and his best friends, Vlad and Brano, ate and drank and just relaxed. Miro couldn't believe the adventure that they were all on together, and he too wanted to soak up every moment that he had up on the mountain, meeting all these people, and of course with his two best friends. As the stars came out over the mountain, all 45 climbers quickly retreated to their tents for warmth. I mean, Russia is cold already, which means an icy slope over 3 miles above sea level is basically a freezer box. Around 9 p.m., most of the climbers were getting ready for bed. You know, they were climbing into their sleeping bags, but they were mostly still awake. But if you're thinking that being awake still might have helped to save them from what was coming, you'll have to guess again, because it turns out the source of the disaster that was about to start was over 150 miles away. An earthquake in northern Afghanistan registered an entirely unremarkable magnitude 6.4 at a depth of over 100 miles, so deep underground that no one on Lenin Peak even felt the ground move. I mean, this was hardly newsworthy for anyone, including the climbers at first, but in very short time, this, mundane, regular earthquake, whatever you want to call it, it was about to become the defining event of their lives. And I say that because this earthquake, deep underground, far, far away, well, it had just dislodged a serac of ice roughly the size of a small apartment building, somewhere far above all of the climbers. And one thing I want to make clear is that the odds of this happening were extremely slim. The events of July 13th were pretty much just a case of bad luck. And also, if you're keeping track, this was a Friday the 13th. At first, everyone just heard like a faint rumble. A climber poked his head out of his tent, saw nothing, and then went back to his cards, went back to getting ready for bed or whatever. But then 30 seconds later, his friend started screaming that it's coming for them. You see, above Camp 2, above the frying pan, 3,000 feet of accumulated snow had broken free of the mountain all at once, and from 1,000 feet below, Miguel Helft was watching it happen in real time, hearing it grow from this faint rumble into something that literally rattled his bones. At the camp itself, the screaming started before anyone could even process what was happening. Climbers burst out of their tents and started running in every direction, and inside one of those tents, Miro heard Brano shout and then scrambled out of his sleeping bag and barely made it to his feet. A few dozens away, Alexei didn't even get like a head start at all like these other guys. One moment he was literally asleep, and the next, his tent was shredded around him, and an invisible force the size of a building was dragging him face down across the mountain at speed, a speed way faster than any human body is built to survive, by the way. The avalanche hit camp, and then all at once, it was over. The snow settled. The roar stopped, and what had been 20 tents and 45 people just a few seconds ago was now a smooth, featureless slope, scoured clean. No trail, no gear, no footprints, no sound at all. Literally nothing. But of course, it wasn't literally nothing, because somewhere underneath all that snow, people were dying in real time. Some of them were even still conscious, to go back to what I said at the very beginning of this video. Hell, some of them could even hear each other. I mean, think about how brutal that is. This had all the makings of a mass casualty event, right? If the original impact didn't kill you, which is basically like being hit by a freight train, by the way, you were either going to die of a lack of oxygen from all the snow on top of you, or if that didn't work, hypothermia. Your chances of surviving a complete burial in an avalanche are basically dependent on time, right? You have about 15 minutes for a 90% chance of survival, but then after 35 minutes, survival rates drop to roughly 30%. You get past 90 minutes and survival is rare unless you get really lucky and you get like a large air pocket that provides continuous oxygen. And it just so turns out that that is exactly what happened to Alexei. I mean, a 1 in a million chance, right? The mechanics of it are almost impossible to picture if you've never been caught in an avalanche, which, if you can't tell, I certainly haven't. The avalanche hit Alexei with the force of a vehicle collision and then basically just took his body wherever it wanted it to go. Thrashing against all the snow did nothing. I mean, you can't swim out or kick out from an avalanche, and of course, panicking like that only burns the one thing that might save you, which is air. And so somewhere inside of all that chaos while he's being swept down the mountain, Alexei's master of sport training kicked in. He curled into a tight ball and cupped his bare hands over his mouth to kind of carve out a small pocket of breathable air. And then he started counting his rotations because, I mean, at this point, counting is like the only thing left in his control. He counted 1 roll, then 2, then 3, and it kept going. He counted 7 total tumbles before being thrown clear off the lip of a serac, landing hard in soft snow on the other side. And yet, despite all of that, somehow, he wasn't buried. The avalanche took him a few hundred yards down the slope of Lenin Peak. It tore his clothes straight off of him, stripping him down to like his thermal underwear, his socks, and then like a fleece jacket. By his own best estimate, the whole thing lasted around 20 seconds. 20 seconds, think about this. 20 seconds between being asleep in a tent and then lying broken and basically naked below what was essentially a mountainside grave. Alexei didn't yet know whether he was gonna actually survive the next 20 minutes, let alone the entire night. He was bruised everywhere. He didn't have his radio. He didn't have a working flashlight that he could find. He didn't have any clue yet whether anyone else on the mountain was even still alive. He started to move though. He knew that he couldn't survive a trek down the mountain alone without any gear at that time of night, and so he searched through the wreckage, desperate for anything that might keep him alive until morning. And the first thing that he found told him exactly how bad this disaster really was. He found a pair of human legs sticking straight up out of snow that had already begun hardening into something that was close to concrete, a lot closer to concrete than snow, it felt like. And this is the part of avalanche physics that shows like how truly terrifying they are. The debris doesn't stay soft and powdery like you might think. Within minutes, it sets up like wet cement, locking around anything and anyone trapped inside of it. Alexei had no choice but to keep searching for gear, but he couldn't find anything except for an emergency blanket and a foam sleeping pad. Well, actually that is until he found something else entirely different. You might know where I'm going with this. He found a moving body, like a moving one. A short distance away, he heard something that didn't belong in the silence. He heard a voice shouting for help in broken, accented Russian. This was the voice of Miro Brosman. Pinned in hardened snow up to the hip, unable to see out of one eye, his torso completely bare where the avalanche had simply ripped the clothing right off of him in air that was already dropping well below freezing. Alexei tore at the snow with his bare hands until he finally broke Miro free, but freeing him from the snow didn't mean that either of them was actually safe. Obviously, I mean, they were two badly injured, half-dressed men alone on a debris field that had just buried everyone around them, with night coming on fast and almost no gear or clothing to survive it with. Whether they were going to see morning was not, at that moment, something that either one of them could have answered honestly. And I want you to picture it like this. Two men who'd never met that night, huddled at altitude in total darkness, wrapped in a single emergency blanket, surrounded on every side by the buried, hardened bodies of 43 other climbers, including somewhere under all of that ice, Miro's two best friends since childhood, Vlad and Brano. Alexei tried shouting for help at first, using the standard Russian mountaineering distress call, 6 shouts per minute, the universal signal that you were in trouble and needed rescue. But after doing this for 20 minutes, 20 minutes of screaming in total silence with nobody and nothing answering you back, he eventually stopped. I mean, it really seemed like there was no one left to even hear him. And so the two men continued pressing together for warmth, and they talked when they had the energy. They slept in fragments and then awoke and just repeated that cycle all night. Miro, who'd learned just enough Russian in school to communicate barely, well, he kept circling the same unanswerable question, which was, had the avalanche taken the entire camp or only a part of it? Was there any chance at all that Vlad and Brano had somehow made it out alive? And look, he didn't know it yet with certainty, but somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the cold, he probably knew, he probably knew his answer, right? In the meantime, roughly 1,000 feet below Camp 2, a 4-person rescue team had mobilized almost immediately, led by Mark Miller and Mike Cross, who, if you remember, were part of the out there trekking expedition that had listened to Alexei's warning about avalanches in the area and pitched their tents away from the frying pan. And they pushed up towards the debris field as fast as the terrain allowed. And when they got there, all they found was rock solid, frozen over snow with zero, I'm telling you, zero visible trace of where the camp had even stood. Again, it was pitch black by this point, and so all they had to assist their search were just their flashlights. And at one point, straining over the sound of speeding winds, they thought they heard the faint echoes of voices coming from somewhere inside the icefall. And so they started listening harder. But the sound didn't repeat again. It was too dark and too dangerous to just blindly search through terrain laced with hidden crevasses and buried corpses. And so this rescue team retreated back to their tents for the night. Again, they weren't up there to rescue people. They were just, in the area. And they planned to return at first light, hoping to find the source of that yelling they had once heard. But at dawn on July 14th, Mark Miller's rescue team returned to the site and they found nothing. No trace of human presence anywhere. A thick fog hung over the mountain, which didn't help the search. Obviously, it obscured their views. And so, convinced that there was literally no one left to save, the rescue team packed up and started back down to Camp 1, where the rest of their expedition had descended to. Miguel Helft, who had stuck his head out of the tent to see the avalanche pour down onto Camp 2, was already breaking the devastating news to everyone at Camp 1. As best as he could tell, there were 0 survivors. But as you might have realized by now, he was wrong, although of course he had no way to know it. Alexei and Miro had miraculously survived the night. And that was the good news, and it was also where the genuinely unpredictable part of this story starts. The two men were still stranded with no rope, no proper boots even. Miro was barely even able to walk at all due to a pelvis injury, and with an entire crevasse-riddled icefall standing between them and anyone who might be able to help, getting down was far from guaranteed. In fact, I would even call it a gamble. Every single step was a tightrope walk between life and death. To get down, Alexei would scout a short distance ahead through the maze of ice blocks and hidden crevasses, then climb back to Miro, then half drag, half carry him forward on the foam sleeping pad, and then rinse and repeat. He would go scout again. And when more thick fog rolled in and made it impossible to tell whether the terrain ahead was sloped up or down, Alexei threw snowballs into the mist and then listened for where they landed, which was the only navigation tool he had left at this point. One wrong step on terrain like this, well, that could end things instantly for either one of them. By mid-afternoon, Miro had basically nothing left. He told Alexei that he couldn't continue. And what's Alexei supposed to do in this situation? I mean, he can try to encourage him to keep going, but I mean, it's Miro's call at the end of the day. And so Alexei wrapped him in the emergency blanket and then left him on that foam sleeping pad in the most sheltered spot he could find in the area. And then he pushed down alone to go find help, knowing that there was no guarantee that he'd make it back in time or even at all to save Miro. And with that, I want you to try sitting in Miro's perspective for a second here. He's now alone, very badly hurt, and stranded on a mountain that had just killed 43 people, including his 2 best friends, and he has zero certainty that anyone would be coming to rescue him. By this point, he was now bracing for a second night on Lenin Peak, knowing that his body probably won't survive, or, probably just as bad, maybe he will just barely survive and then certainly die the next day. But fortunately for Miro, Alexei was not about to give up. Not on himself or on Miro, of course. Alexei descended for hours, and as he rounded the edge of Serac, he spotted some movement. A climber that was actually heading up towards him. And then he saw another figure, and then another. A mixed Soviet and Czechoslovak rescue party had finally organized, and they were pushing up the mountain. And so Alexei told them about Miro, and he asked them to push higher to go get him, while he continued down the mountain in desperate need of some rescue himself. Alexei made it back to Camp 1 just after midnight, thinking the entire way about nothing more complicated than just a glass of lemonade that he would reward himself with for making it through this absolute nightmare. And incredibly, beyond one massive, deeply painful bruise across his back, he walked away with no broken bones and no frostbite at all. But Miro, on the other hand, well, he was not doing nearly as well. By the time that the rescue team reached him, he was in need of some serious medical attention. And so they dragged him to some flatter ground, pitched emergency tents, and then started treatment that lasted through the night. And then at first light, they loaded him onto a metal rescue sled for a very long ride down. Against all odds, Alexei and Miro survived July 13th, 1990 on Lenin Peak. But once again, 43 climbers. I mean, it's crazy to even say it out loud. 43 climbers did not survive, which, to my knowledge at least, makes this the deadliest single day on a mountain in human history. And you might think that surviving the single deadliest day in the history of mountaineering might be the universe's way of politely suggesting you take up a new hobby, but that is not what happened. Miro went home, he recovered, and he kept climbing. Though he did deliberately shift towards rock climbing and competitive ski mountaineering and consciously chose to stop returning to high altitude peaks. And Alexei, for his part, went ahead with his planned Cho-OU expedition just a few months later. Years later, he was asked whether the avalanche had ever made him consider quitting, and his answer came back almost before the question was even finished. He said, quote, "No, it was not my mistake." Mark Miller, the guide whose tired legs decision had saved his entire team's lives, kept guiding too, but only for 2 more years. Tragedy would end up striking him and all of the souls aboard a PIA Airbus flying outside Kathmandu when their plane crashed in 1992. But folks, here's the detail that should probably haunt you more than anything else in this story. Of the 43 climbers killed that night, only one single body was recovered in the immediate aftermath. And I've scoured the internet to try to find the identity of that person, but I just couldn't find it. All we know is that the hardened debris from the avalanche didn't melt away. It became part of the mountain itself for almost 17 years. For 17 years, the families of these victims had no grave, no body, no final image except a campsite erased under frozen avalanche debris. But then, in 2007, Lenin Peak decided to change its mind. With rising temperatures, more melt has come off the mountain, and fragments of that lost camp started to resurface far below where the avalanche had actually struck. I'm talking shredded tent fabric, cooking pots, portable stoves, even intact passports. And of course, once they started finding these things, recovery expeditions began, and there was even some new hope that maybe the mountain would return the bodies of the lives that it had taken. Alexei himself felt like a personal obligation to take part in the search, and so over the following years, he joined 5 separate recovery trips back up the mountain, and yet still, no identifiable bodies have been found besides just One, they've found bones, they have found mangled body parts, but really nothing beyond that. No closure for the families, just fragments of memory. A memorial plaque now stands at base camp of Lenin Peak, engraved with all 43 names of the climbers who perished. And whatever partial remains have surfaced over the years now rest in a burial site nearby. Camp 2 itself has since been relocated roughly 300 yards away from the frying pan to a spot that's now generally considered safer from avalanches, but hey, you never know. And speaking of that, Alexei himself isn't entirely convinced by that designation of safer. In recent years, he's pointed out that the new camp location actually sits inside the boundary of the original 1990 avalanche. And so while it is a low probability that lightning strikes twice, or I guess avalanche strikes twice, I do think it's fair to say that Lenin Peak is no longer considered the easiest or safest mountain in Russia. And so here's the actual lesson buried inside the Lenin Peak disaster. Pardon my pun there. It's a lesson that chills me to my bones because after making, tons of videos about mountaineering disasters, almost always there was like a mistake that people made that led to them dying, right? But in this case, as far as I can tell, that didn't really happen. I mean, sure, maybe they should have set up in a different spot. There was a little bit of known avalanche risk, obviously, but I don't think that they were being reckless here. No one was being complacent. The real lesson is honestly a very uncomfortable one. Sometimes the mountain genuinely does not care how experienced you are, how many warning signs you've correctly identified in the past, or how cozy and mundane your evening routine felt just an hour before everything changed. Sometimes a magnitude 6.4 earthquake originating 150 miles away is enough to dislodge a single block of ice that will go on to erase 43 human beings in under 30 seconds. Mountaineering experts actually have a clinical term for this. It's called a low probability, high consequence event. And I have a slightly less cynical one. I call it nature reminding everyone, once again, that mountains like Lenin Peak were never on your side to begin with, and the mountain never agreed to any of the rules that you assumed that you were playing by. It never agreed to be called a warm-up. Now, to this day, Lenin Peak is still climbed by hundreds of people every single season, and every one of these climbers has to walk right past that memorial plaque I told you about, documenting the single most deadly day in recorded mountaineering history. They then have to walk by the debris field where Camp 2 had once stood, where 43 people were trapped, buried alive, and for the most part are forever entombed. May all of these victims rest in peace, and I would really appreciate it if you guys could show some love for them in the comments. I always appreciate it when you do that. I have the best audience. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're not already subscribed, I hope I earned your sub at the end of this video here. We're so close to 1 million subscribers, and your support truly means everything. And speaking of support, once again, please click the link below and check out My Heritage. Awesome sponsors like them make these videos possible, and you'll also be getting a really insane deal on their DNA kit. YouTube seems to think you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click, and I appreciate all of you so much.